The stage lights were barely warm when the tension started bubbling beneath the surface. Stephen had invited Clint Eastwood onto his show for what was meant to be a nostalgic conversation about legacy, cinema, and wisdom. But instead of a calm, reverent exchange, the interview spiraled into something far more combustible. It began with a question Stephen knew would push boundaries, a comment laced with smug irony about Eastwood's old-fashioned worldview and political stance. Clint, a man who had stood unshaken through decades of Hollywood turbulence, didn't flinch. But his stare, cold, deliberate, spoke volumes before he uttered a single word. From the moment Clint responded, the air changed. The audience, once cheerfully buzzing, grew awkwardly silent, sensing a shift in tone. Clint wasn't there to be mocked, and Stephen had just crossed an invisible line. What followed was not a debate, but a verbal collision between two titans of their crafts, each unwilling to bow to the other. Stephen leaned in with his signature smugness, twisting Clint's legacy into a punchline. He poked at Eastwood's decades-long career, portraying it as relics of a bygone era, painting him as an outdated symbol in a world that had supposedly moved on. But Clint, with that signature stoic resolve, returned fire. Not with charm, not with diplomacy, but with an honesty so sharp it cut through the room like glass. He reminded everyone, including Stephen, why his presence still commanded attention, not out of nostalgia but sheer force of character. There was no laughter now, just eyes shifting nervously between the two men as the back and forth escalated. Stephen, determined not to lose control of his own show, grew increasingly sarcastic, trying to spin Clint's words as out-of-touch ranting. But Clint wasn't unraveling. He was tightening. Every word he delivered was laced with authority, his tone unshaken, his posture calm, his gaze piercing. And then came the turning point, the moment that changed the energy in the room. Stephen, visibly frustrated, questioned Clint's relevance in today's America, suggesting that voices like his had no place in modern discourse. That was the trigger. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He didn't storm off. Instead, he launched into a response that felt less like a defense and more like an autopsy, on modern media, on late-night television, and on the arrogance that often disguises itself as wit. The audience, unsure whether to cheer or gasp, fell into stunned silence. What began as an interview had transformed into a confrontation, not just between two men, but between two eras, two philosophies, and two versions of what American influence really means. And Stephen, used to being the smartest person in the room, finally looked like he wasn't so sure anymore. Stephen shifted in his seat, a subtle sign of discomfort he tried to hide behind a half-smile. But the smirk didn't land. Clint had delivered his message with such piercing clarity that the audience hadn't dared to applaud or laugh. They were frozen, unsure whether they were watching a television segment or witnessing something far more intimate and far more volatile. Stephen wasn't used to silence. He thrived on applause, on crowd reinforcement, on being the conductor of an orchestra that laughed when he pointed the baton. But now, that baton felt limp in his hands, and Clint Eastwood had seized the rhythm. Trying to recover, Stephen shifted the conversation to Clint's personal beliefs, aiming to corner him into controversy. He referenced Clint's comments from past interviews and twisted them to seem outlandish in today's climate. It wasn't a question. It was an ambush. Stephen was desperate to frame the conversation around his domain, a battlefield of wit and optics where his charisma had won countless times before. But this time, he wasn't up against a celebrity eager to play along. He was sitting across from a man who had built his entire career on defying expectation and refusing to play games. Clint leaned forward, not with aggression, but with a presence so firm that Stephen visibly recoiled. The audience picked up on the shift. Clint began to peel back the layers of Stephen's performance, exposing the rehearsed charm, the crowd-pleasing deflections, the illusion of vulnerability that masked cold strategy. What was meant to be a dialogue was now a slow dismantling. And Clint wasn't doing it with theatrical flourish. He was doing it like a carpenter, removing each plank of Stephen's persona until only the raw nerves remained. Stephen attempted to laugh it off. He tried spinning Clint's words as grumpy ramblings, painting him as a dinosaur stomping around in an age of rockets. But Clint didn't budge. His voice remained steady, his composure intact. He began listing failures, not his own, but Stephen's, failed interviews where guests had walked out, political figures who had used the show as a platform, only to later betray the audience's trust. Clint brought receipts, memories the audience didn't want to remember but now couldn't ignore. The studio grew thick with tension. The camera crew began to exchange glances. The producer standing off stage leaned in, signaling a commercial break, but Clint spoke right through it. Stephen's face was twitching now, the cracks forming as his guest refused to play by the unspoken rules. He wasn't just losing control of the conversation, he was losing control of the room. Then came the most brutal blow. Clint called out the very foundation of Stephen's show, his self-appointed role as moral compass. He challenged the notion that mockery equaled truth, that ridicule was activism, that smirking through issues replaced actual conviction. It wasn't a tantrum. It was a masterclass in restraint and impact. Every word Clint delivered left a mark, not because it was loud, but because it was honest, and because no one had ever dared say it to Stephen's face. By the time Stephen tried to regain control, it was too late. Clint had already reshaped the moment. The audience had already started to view the host not as the usual confident ringleader, but as someone caught off guard, someone exposed. And though Stephen tried to move on, pivot to a lighter segment, the damage was irreversible. Clint sat back, calm as ever, as if daring Stephen to try again. But Stephen's next move wasn't a question. It was a personal jab, something bitter and beneath the polished image he had cultivated over years. He brought up Clint's family, hinting at estrangement and conflict, hoping to finally push him over the edge. But Clint didn't break. He leaned in again, and what he said next would cause the entire internet to explode within hours. The moment Stephen dragged Clint's family into the fire, something in the room shifted. Not a visible explosion, not a vocal outburst, but a chilling stillness. Clint sat motionless, but the air around him grew heavier, denser. Stephen had touched something sacred, and for the first time that night, it wasn't Clint who felt exposed. It was Stephen. The audience, still and waiting, leaned forward as if they, too, realized a line had been crossed. Clint didn't raise his voice. He didn't stumble over words. Instead, with a calmness that carried more power than any rant, he brought the conversation to a place Stephen never expected, to a mirror. Not a literal one, but something far more unsettling. An honest, blistering reflection of who Stephen had become. He spoke not of himself, but of legacy, of what it meant to be remembered not for who applauded you, but for what you stood for when the applause faded. He peeled away the glamour of nightly applause, the flashing lights, the smirking monologues, and exposed the hollow routine behind it. Stephen's brand had been built on the image of resistance, on quick-witted criticism of political chaos and celebrity absurdity. But Clint questioned if the resistance had become performance, if the critique had become comfort food for an audience too afraid to face uncomfortable truths. Stephen tried to interject, to throw a jab and regain some footing, but it fell flat. The crowd wasn't laughing anymore. They were watching, stunned, as a Hollywood legend dissected their beloved host with surgical precision, not to humiliate, but to wake him up. Clint wasn't angry. He was resolved, and that made it all the more devastating. What followed was Clint's refusal to play the victim. He admitted to his faults, his regrets, the parts of his life that hadn't been neat or heroic. And in doing so, he stole every ounce of moral high ground Stephen thought he held. Because while Stephen postured with perfect rhetoric, Clint told The truth, raw, unscripted, and immune to cancellation. Stephen sat back, visibly shaken. His usual strategies, shifting blame, changing subjects, pivoting to humor, had lost their grip. He had used Clint as a target for a viral moment, but now he was the one trending for all the wrong reasons. Viewers weren't rallying behind him. They were rewatching Clint's words, dissecting each point, sharing clips titled not with praise for Stephen's performance, but with questions like, "Has Colbert finally met his match?" Back on set, Clint stood up slowly. Not to storm off, but to command the space one final time. He thanked the crew, not Stephen. He nodded to the audience, not in triumph, but in respect. And then, in a moment that would be replayed across platforms for days, he turned to Stephen and made one final remark, not bitter, not sarcastic, but sharp enough to silence the entire building. It was a challenge, not a personal insult, but a demand. A call to step out of the comfort of performance and into the grit of accountability. And for the first time in years, Stephen didn't have a clever comeback. He sat there, blinking, as the camera pulled back and the music failed to mask the discomfort. Clint exited the stage like a man who knew he had nothing left to prove. But the story didn't end there. Because the very next morning, headlines exploded with reactions, not from fans, but from other celebrities, fellow directors, and former guests who had sat across from Stephen and endured similar jabs. And what they shared would turn this into more than just a viral argument. The next morning arrived like thunder. Social media platforms flooded with clips, reactions, and think pieces dissecting every second of the confrontation between Clint Eastwood and Stephen. What had started as an awkward late-night segment had exploded into a full-blown cultural moment. Clint's calm dismantling of the host had been clipped and recirculated with millions of views within hours. But more importantly, it had cracked something deeper, something hidden behind years of laughter tracks and rehearsed outrage. Celebrities who had once stayed silent began to speak. Former guests, comedians, filmmakers, and even musicians weighed in. Some defended Stephen, loyal to the format and the man behind the desk. But a surprising number came forward with stories that mirrored Clint's experience. Stories of subtle manipulation, of having their words twisted for the sake of a joke, of feeling like props rather than guests. They didn't accuse Stephen of being evil. They accused him of being lost in his own creation. As the conversation spread, the media scrambled to catch up. Clint, meanwhile, remained silent. No interviews, no follow-ups, no social media statements. His silence only amplified the weight of his words from the night before. It became clear he hadn't gone on the show for publicity. He hadn't gone to stir drama. He had simply reached a point where someone needed to speak up, and no one else had the backbone to do it. Inside the studio, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. Staff members who once moved around Stephen with robotic efficiency now carried a new edge in their tone, a hesitation that hadn't existed before. The usual rhythm of the show felt disrupted. The script, once tight and polished, now seemed fragile. Even Stephen himself was different. His monologue the following night was noticeably tamer, filled with awkward pauses and self-referential jokes that failed to land. He looked tired. Not physically, but spiritually, like someone who had seen the cracks in their own reflection, and couldn't look away. Behind the scenes, producers began having hard conversations. Ratings were high, but respect was lower than ever. There were whispers about bringing in guest hosts, about soft rebranding, about toning down the personal attacks. Some even wondered if Clint's appearance had marked the beginning of the end for the show's current era. But Clint didn't care about any of that. He was seen a week later at a charity event, quiet, composed, as if none of it had fazed him. When asked by a reporter about the interview, he gave no grand commentary. He simply nodded and walked away. Because for Clint, the point had never been to win a battle. It had been about restoring a sense of truth in a space that had become too enamored with its own echo. And that's where the triumph lay, not in humiliation, not in revenge, but in integrity. Clint hadn't yelled. He hadn't lashed out. He had spoken plainly, and in doing so, he reminded an entire audience that sometimes the loudest voice in the room isn't the one yelling. It's the one refusing to play along. Stephen eventually addressed the moment with a carefully crafted statement, an apology without the word sorry, an explanation without taking real responsibility. But by then the audience had moved on. The power had shifted. In the end, Clint Eastwood didn't just fire back. He held up a mirror to the industry, to the audience, and to Stephen himself. And what they saw staring back wasn't just one man's reflection. It was a warning. That truth doesn't always come dressed in applause. Sometimes it walks in slowly, speaks once, and leaves everything burning in its wake. And that's exactly what Clint did.